Antich. I'm with the Automotive Fleet magazine, and today I'll be hosting a webinar dealing with best practices, solutions, and lessons learned in managing a fleet during a pandemic. And I'm honored to have as my guests for this presentation that's being done collaboratively with the Automotive Fleet and Leasing Association, 3 members of the Automotive Fleet Commercial Fleet Sounding Board. And with that, would like to introduce the 3 panelists. First is Matt Betts. He's with DTE Energy.
Thanks, Mike. I'm happy to participate. And I actually thought this was going to be a video conference, and it gave me a reason to get up and shave and get out of my pajamas today.
Next, we have Katie Keaton, and Katie is the fleet manager for Siemens.
Yes, thanks, Mike. Glad to be here with you today, sitting here in somewhat cloudy New Jersey. Looking forward to the conversation.
Very good. And then last is Phil Samuelson. He is with USIC Locating Services.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mike. Thanks to you, Automotive Fleet and AFLA, for putting this together. I'm looking forward to working with everybody on the next hour. Mm-hmm. And luckily, half the people in Indianapolis have power again after a vicious storm came through here last night. So.
Oh, terrific. Well, let's get started with this discussion. And Matt, who's the chair of the AFLA Commercial Fleet Sounding Board, I'd like you to kind of set this as a big picture. I mean, currently we're in the pandemic now. It's really an unprecedented situation. None of us have really had any sort of prior experience in dealing with this. Can you kind of go through and just from your perspective, AFLA's perspective, and the perspective of your company, you know, we all have contingency plans for emergencies, but how is this different, is kind of setting that up as our broad context that we're going to be discussing.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And first, as the chair of the sounding board, I'd like to thank you and Bobbitt for helping AFLA organize this webinar. You know, as I look back over the years, I've worked with many large, very complex fleets. And most of them have some idea of what they would do in a disaster or an emergency. And based on where they are in the country, where they're located, they might focus on certain types of disasters. Some fleets, like a very large state fleet that I worked with at one time, just by the nature of their organization and the type of fleet, had to have a really tight plan. They had to know where every vehicle was at every time and what that vehicle's capabilities were in case they got called on for an emergency. But I can tell you that not many fleets that I've talked to had any plan for anything like this in place. And we thought that since most people tell us that they value their AFLA membership for both networking and education, we thought this was the right topic and the right time to have this type of an exchange.
Excellent. Yeah, I can tell you I can wholeheartedly agree with that in my conversations with many fleet managers throughout the industry. And one of the topics that's really uppermost in the minds of a lot of fleet managers is, you know, how you go about sanitizing vehicles to minimize the virus contagion. And Matt, since you have the stage still, let me kick that off to you first and have you answer that question as to how that's handled from DTE's perspective.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I thought of here. First, and something that I think some people overlook, is that we need to remind drivers that while they're in the vehicle and while they may be the only driver of the vehicle, they still need to practice some sort of hygiene you know, in the vehicle, because they never know when somebody else might have to use that vehicle or when they might have to take that vehicle in for service. So just reminding them that because they're in the vehicle by themselves doesn't mean that they, you know, are okay to sneeze all over the dashboard, that type of thing. And then at DTE, because we have a fleet that is shared among drivers and between shifts, we did go out of our way to create a very specific list of items that need to be cleaned between each use. And so as a driver begins his shift and as he leaves his shift, he goes through these specific steps and things that need to be cleaned. And to make sure that we clearly communicated that to all drivers, actually our fleet group and our safety group got together and created a video that we made available to all DTE employees. Maybe we can show the group that video now.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Ewald, Field Safety Specialist for Corporate Services. I'd like to show you the proper use of disinfecting a truck whenever you enter or at the end of your shift. You're going to use a Clorox disinfectant wipe or equivalent. And you're going to use proper PPE, which are going to be the nitrite gloves. All right, now we're going to start to wipe down the truck. We're going to have our nitrite gloves on. Suggested to have safety glasses on. We're going to take out a number of wipes, and we're going to wipe down the surface and make sure it stays wet for 15 seconds to disinfect. We're wiping down the door handle at this time, and now we're going to enter the truck. Now that we've disinfected the outside handle, we've opened the door. Now we're going to disinfect the commonly touched areas around the door. You know, people keep their arms on the door, rest their arms on the door. We're going to disinfect the controls, plus the underneath of the controls. We're going to disinfect the lock button. Then we're going to go to the back door if applicable. We're going to disinfect the handle there. We're going to disinfect the seat belt latch, hit the seat belt a little bit itself. Now that the door's been disinfected, you're going to enter the vehicle and you're going to start wiping down the steering wheel, the buttons on the steering wheel, the radio controls, the shifter, the turn signal knob, the dashboard. Wipe down the dashboard where anybody could have sneezed or coughed on it. You're going to wipe down the radio controls. You're going to wipe down the HVAC system. And also wipe down anywhere where somebody might have had their arm or might have sneezed or coughed. They may think that they're by themselves so they don't have to cover up, but they don't know if somebody else is going to be getting in their truck. So please wipe down anything you think that might have. Here's the door handle over here to get into, or actually the grab handle for proper egress and entrance of the vehicle. Wipe down anything you thought might have been touched by the previous person. Thank you for watching the video. This is how we recommend wiping down a vehicle before entering or before at the end of your shift. Thank you very much for watching. Be safe and practice good hygiene in these trying times. Thank you.
That was a great video, Matt. Thank you for sharing that with us. You know, it reminded me of the, I know, as AFLA president and being involved over the years in managing a large fleet myself, a best practice certainly is having a vehicle inspection report in place, a vehicle inspection report pre and post trip, as well as condition reports as, drivers or employees come in and out of vehicles. So certainly, it's an important time to take a look at that report and think about what could be added in terms of vehicle sanitation.
One of the questions that I hear, I likewise echo what Katie just said. That's an excellent video, Matt. But one of the things that I hear from fleet managers is what happens when that driver of an assigned vehicle tests positive? What do you do with that vehicle? Does your sanitizing procedures change in any way, or do you let it sit idle for 72 hours? I've heard all kinds of things. I was just curious if you might be able to address that.
Yeah, we have a very specific process that we go through when a driver has tested positive. And unfortunately, that's happened several times. And so that vehicle gets quarantined immediately. And then there is a professional company. In fact, we've contracted with 3 of them here within the state of Michigan, and they come in and professionally sanitize that vehicle before it's released back into service. So it goes way beyond the sort of wipe down procedures that we just witnessed in the video, should a driver test positive.
Very good. Let's move on to our next topic, our next topic, which is going to be dealing with the area of work crews. And I know this is another big issue, especially with the mandates and recommendations on having social distancing. Many applications or many industrial segments do have work crews that are transported in a single vehicle out to the website, out to the job site. How do you handle that? What sort of procedures are in place dealing with work crews and balancing that against the need for social distancing? With that, I'd like to pose that question to you, Phil.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Yeah, this particular instance kind of snuck up on us, and we started receiving calls from our crew, the company or the part of our company that has the crews, and they said we need the capability of moving everyone out to the job site, but not in the same vehicle. So what we did is we looked at our fleet and found spare vehicles that we were either getting ready to retire under our normal cycling plan, and shipped them to the location that needed them, and then allowed also to make sure that those vehicles had enough of the safety features on them, like cones and things like that, because we were adding more vehicles to the zone, that was the construction zone itself. So that in itself creates kind of a safety risk that we wanted to make sure they were addressing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'd add to that, Mike.
Go ahead, man.
Couple things, because our guys usually work in crews also. So a couple things. We have changed the work rules. We cannot put more than one driver in a vehicle. That has caused us, of course, as fleet managers to do many of the same things that Phil has done. But also, like one day last week, we put 50 trucks, rental trucks, into service in one day, just to try to fill the demand. And then one thing that DTE has done is we do have some jobs where they can't help but work in close proximity of each other for safety reasons. And so everybody, is wearing gloves and masks. And where those situations exist, I believe they're teaming those people up, and those 2 crew members stay teamed throughout this event. So that way, if one of them, should show signs, the other one gets pulled from work duty at the same time. They're not mixing crews.
Mm-hmm. I believe that our teams are doing that as well. And we did this recently, go company-wide with facial masks as well for the crews, especially those that work close together. One of the other things we did too, Mike, it's not directly related to this, but it kind of helps in that situation, is we also delayed our PM services. We have automated announcements to go to all our drivers from our FMS, from our fleet management company that says, or in the FMS department, when their PMs are due. And we said, if you're not comfortable going in to do the PM at this time, that's fine. We'll catch that up. But it also decreases the number of vehicles that we have in the shop at any given time, so that we have more of those spare vehicles available.
One question that we just got from the audience, how do you handle it when you don't have an extra vehicle? It's great to have a number of vehicles that you can alternate through, but what if you don't have an extra vehicle to handle? Is the rental the route to go?
That's what we're doing. We're taxing our relationships. Fortunately, we rent a lot of vehicles for peak use, so we have great relationships with vendors in the area. But we are taxing their resources, I think, at this point, to make sure that we have enough vehicles in the field.
I would think that with the travel, the way it is right now, that the rental companies might have the vehicles available, at least,
Yes.
this time.
Yeah, here's another question from a reader. And are you doing any sort of routing with your vehicles to ensure that it minimizes them going to any sort of high-risk areas, such as a fueling station, so they don't put themselves in a vulnerable position there, or other areas where they might be encountering a high risk of contact with the virus?
Well, we're in a unique situation for most fleets in that we have our own garages. We operate 28 garages around the state of Michigan, and almost all of those have fueling facilities as well. We do have some drivers in some locations that do have to fuel at retail locations, but I have not seen where we're changing that behavior at all, other than asking them to wear gloves when they use the pumps and sanitize their hands afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Right. That would be the same for USIC. I mean, follow the CDC guidelines. We do not have private fueling, so our drivers have to go to the public fueling.
One of the attendees gave another website to use for providing step-by-step sanitizing of vehicles. It's actually in Australia, but I'll just read this out. It's nrssampp.org.au. So that is another venue that you can use to get a step-by-step on sanitizing vehicles. What about group transportation? A lot of times it's not just work crews, but a lot of companies operate vans on shuttling employees. Katie, is there any, does that impact Siemens in any way, or do you have any advice in that area?
I'm sorry, Mike, can you repeat the question? I was checking out that awesome website you just mentioned.
Oh, yeah, actually, for both you and Phil, a lot of companies, in addition to transporting work crews in a single vehicle, they also have group transportation for employees, primarily using, full-size passenger vans. Any sort of guidelines that either you or Phil could offer in that area?
As far as Siemens is concerned, we're not allowing crews to be in the same vehicle together. So in order to maintain physical distance and, follow all the proper protocols that everyone should be following right now, we're completely limiting that.
Yeah, that directly is a problem for us right now. This is a peak hiring season for us normally. And we already this year have hired over 2,000 people. So a big part of that is that social distancing makes it difficult. Luckily, we have some really, awesome people in our HR department and our EHS department and our training department that have, they've all come together and they've figured out ways to minimize the numbers that can, be in a room at the same time. So we separate rooms, we separate that pattern of hiring now, instead of those trainees going out into the field to learn their the company in a van, like you mentioned, Mike. We are changing that up and providing the vehicles at the forefront of the class instead at the end, which changes around the dynamics of how they're being trained. They go in and do their driver training and all that earlier than what they used to, so that we can, as much as we can, keep that social distancing and also make sure that the people are separated in the vehicle.
Okay, great discussion on this. Let's go to another topic that a lot of fleets are encountering, and that is in the area of employees that are furloughed who've been assigned company vehicles. How do you go about managing that? I know I've received a lot of emails from other fleet managers, requesting any sort of best practices or advice from other fleets as to how they're handling these vehicles that have been assigned to employees who have either been furloughed, temporarily laid off, or even terminated. How are you handling the pickup in that area? And I'd like to pose that question to you, Phil.
Yeah, we have, since we do so much hiring and have such a higher turnover in our company, that's kind of a practice that we're pretty good at. For those who are temporarily furloughed or on some sort of leave right now, the vehicle stays with the employee until we feel like we would have to go get it. And through telematics, we can tell whether or not the vehicle is being moved. And also we would temporarily suspend the fuel card and things like that. We always do. And that way the vehicle stays with the driver, and we are going to avoid having to do the sanitizing things that we talked about earlier. And hopefully, that driver is going to come back and get to work for us again here soon. So if we have a terminated employee, then we would have the same process when the person in those areas that are responsible for picking up the vehicles, like the supervisor or the operations people in that field area, they would follow the sanitizing suggestions again, like that have been put out by the CDC, and similar to Matt's video, clean the vehicle up and bring it back and get it ready for the next hire.
Mm-hmm. Do those individuals or employees that actually pick up those vehicles, do you have any sort of documentation that you give them in case they're pulled over by the police if they're in a lockdown state?
We do, yes.
We're in that area?
Yeah, and this wouldn't be applicable to every company, obviously, but we are considered critical in the industry by the Department of Homeland Security and Cybersecurity Infrastructure, I think it's called, because of what our particular company does. And all of our employees have that documentation in their vehicle, and they're asked to keep that with them at all times. And also, our EHS department just recently put out even something a little further than that, that's put in a window that just would explain to anyone, why that particular vehicle is still out on the road.
Mm-hmm. What about Siemens, Katie? What kind of guidelines does Siemens have?
Yep. Yeah. So same here. We were instructing not just, for folks transporting our vehicles, but for our drivers who are out there. We also are business critical. And so, just a few tips in addressing, any situation where they were pulled over and how to properly handle that. It's again just another resource that, it's really important to provide your employees with all the information they need as they're out there encountering these different scenarios. So we're just trying to equip people as best we can.
Yeah, one of the things that's come up in the course of this pandemic is that famous line, the devil's in the details. You don't really think about all these things until you actually encounter them. And one of the areas is our next topic is driver training. I know some of your companies have pretty robust driver training programs, either for the applications that they're going to be using. How do you handle those during the pandemic? And I'll pose that question to you, Phil, because I know your company does have a pretty robust training program.
Right. And fortunately, we also have a really good department that does a lot of learning management system work for us. So a lot of our training is already on our LMS system, and they can do that while keeping that social distancing. And then as far as the actual driving piece of that, then you would obviously, instead of just being two people in a vehicle, I haven't seen this live yet, but as my understanding is our trainers who are doing that piece of that, are just literally watching them from another vehicle while they're going through that training. But luckily, the LMS systems, they're so advanced now that they really do a great job of allowing people to have that training up front.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add too, with training that we've definitely seen a shift. So any in-person training that we were doing, whether it be for new hires or sales or service, any ongoing training that was scheduled for in-person has quickly moved to virtual.
Yeah, I'm hearing the same thing from others out in the industry. That seems to be the overall trend in this area. A lot of the attendees that are on the phone here are watching us online manage in-house maintenance facilities, and I want to address the needs of those attendees and start talking about shop maintenance best practices. I know DTE has an extensive in-house maintenance operation, and would like to pose the questions to you, Matt, if you could discuss best practices there. And one of the areas that I hear a lot of from readers and other fleet managers is the issue of shared tools. And when you're in a maintenance environment, there are going to be certain tools that are shared that need to be sanitized, the social distancing and so on being maintained in a shop environment. What are DTE's guidelines, recommendations, and protocols in those areas?
Yeah, well, this is not just DTE, but this has forced a lot of companies that operate their own garages to make changes, not just to cleaning tools, but just how do you keep all the technicians safe and still keep those mission-critical vehicles on the road. So a couple things that have happened, I think, both in our fleet and others. First, nobody is allowed anymore in the garage other than the technicians. So it used to be that the business unit might, come into the building when they drop the vehicle off, talk to the mechanic, that type of thing. None of that happens anymore. I've heard of companies splitting their technician crews, so where they might have been on a 8-hour day from 9 to 5 or something like that, and had 12 mechanics in the shop. Now they've gone to 2 shifts with 6 mechanics on each shift that allows them to keep social distancing and still work on vehicles. Common sense things like limiting 2 people in the break room at one time, which is a little bit easier when you have half the people there. More frequent sanitizing of the break room, of bathrooms, common areas. And then tools, when it comes to tools, most mechanics use their own tools in terms of the sort of small tools, if you will, that they use. But they do use things like lifts and hoists and some other bigger items jointly. And so there's a protocol developed to clean those at the end of each shift. And then as the fresh shift comes on, they also wipe them down. And then a couple of other things that I would not have thought of. A number of people I talked to have closed down their loaner fleets. So where a business unit used to be able to get a loaner vehicle when they dropped off their current vehicle for service, the loaners are not available anymore. And of course, this isn't as big a problem in some areas because of the lighter workload. And then one fleet manager that I talked to has created a FEMA work code for the sanitization of the vehicle. So all the time that is spent wiping down the vehicles gets a work code in their system, just like an oil change or anything else. And the reasoning was that if this ever is declared a national emergency, he said that time is then reimbursable by FEMA. And that is not something I had heard in the past. So that's something, I don't have a lot of details on that, but if I can get details if anybody's interested.
Okay. If anybody would like those details, you can send in a question. We have gotten a lot of responses from people that are asking me to repeat the Australian website. And let me do that again. I'll do it a little bit slower. So it's nrspp.org, org.au in Australia. If you're still having difficulty with that, feel free to email me at mike.antich@bobbit.com, and I'll personally send you a reply to that. Let me deal with another area in terms of shop best practices. A lot of technicians are being issued gloves and masks and so on to protect themselves when maintaining these vehicles, and they're encouraged to dispose of these disposables, the gloves and so on. The question I have is, when you dispose that, and I know several fleet managers have asked me the question, is that now considered a biohazard waste? And I know, Phil, you've looked into this, and I'm wondering if you might be able to address that. What is your discussions come up with?
Yeah, everything that we have discussed internally has said no. At this point, they're not considered viable. They're not hazardous. But latex or the nitrate or the polyester, all those gloves are not to be recycled either. They should be put in a normal trash receptacle, but not a recycling receptacle like they could have in the past. But at this point, unless someone is directly in contact with COVID-19, someone who is tested positive, and in this particular case, there would be no reason to consider them biohazard.
Mm-hmm. A lot of times the techs have their own work gloves that obviously are reused. I've heard some techs actually spraying their gloves with Lysol to try to disinfect them to make sure that they aren't passing on or transmitting the virus onto other surfaces that they come in contact with. What's the viability of that? And I'd like to pose that to you, Matt. Has there been any discussions in terms of work glove use and how to sanitize them and keep them safe?
No, I believe that everything we're doing is disposable gloves, and then if they have to wear their gloves over those, for protection, they do. But I believe that they're still wearing disposable gloves and disposing of them each time.
Mm-hmm.
And Matt, is that in addition to the gloves that you're referring to? Then they would wear for normal electric work and things like that, correct? They're using
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that reminds me of Matt and I had an earlier conversation, and this goes back to work crews and having that social distance. One of the auxiliary devices that DTE operates on its trucks are the aerial lifts, and I think you have a policy where you need two people manning those, and I was wondering if you might address that and how you're dealing with that issue.
Yeah, that's related to the issue that I mentioned earlier with the crews that have to work in close proximity. So from a safety standpoint, we have two people. They're double buckets is what it is. So there are usually two people working, but as you might guess, those buckets are very close together. They're not 6 feet apart. And so those are some of the crews that are paired together. And they stay working together as a team throughout this event, so that should one of them show any signs, the other one can be pulled from service as well.
Mm-hmm. We just got an email from one attendee, and I think it's an excellent question, especially in light of the fact that so many people have been furloughed from companies. But as part of that company's fleet policy, they're allowed personal use. So the question here is, has anyone had to address personal use charges with the tool of the trade fleets? During this time, would you be charging 100% personal use where your drivers would be charged a higher tax? So if your drivers aren't using the vehicles in day-to-day work environments because they're furloughed, they're sheltered in place, that's obviously going to change that ratio of personal use miles to business miles. How do you address that, and have you given any thought to that, Katie?
We have given thought to it, so it's certainly on our radar, but at this point in time, we still have a lot of folks out there on the road. Certainly less business use for sure, and obviously, among the passenger vehicle drivers. But at this point, we have not made any adjustments to personal use deductions.
Okay. Well, let's move the conversation along, and let's look into our next topic of discussion, and this is best practices, and this, I think, is an area that a lot of fleet managers struggle with, and not only fleet managers, but operation managers, sales managers, but this interaction with internal and external customers. And so one of the issues that I've heard is let's say that employee who's assigned a company vehicle starts to feel sick. What sort of advice do you offer, even if they haven't been fully tested? Does Siemens have any sort of guidelines as to how to deal with that, Katie?
Yeah, absolutely. Very simply put, the guidance is to stay at home. So if you begin to feel sick, even slightly, we don't want to risk it. So again, business critical organization, we're doing really important things around keeping hospitals running and different infrastructure. But at the same time, number one priority is employee safety. So, and again, things are being communicated regularly, and it all starts with, all of those key elements. So kind of check in with yourself. How are you feeling before you go out there and interact with customers or whatever the case may be? Certainly make sure that you're well before you do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the case of your fleet, Phil, sometimes your employees actually have to go on a customer's property, or maybe even sometimes actually come in much closer proximity. And in some fleets where they actually enter the home, how is that being addressed nowadays?
Yes, luckily at this point, most of our employees in all of our companies do not have to enter customer homes at all. None of them do really. They do enter the property though. So the guidelines would be just to follow the normal social distancing guidelines that everybody's working under, and to kind of just to agree with what Katie was saying. Our guidelines at any given time. If you don't feel well, contact your supervisor, contact your local HR person, and go home and stay away from people. But nothing really out of the ordinary other than that. And it is, it's more difficult for our people right now because everybody is at home and they're all out in their yards or walking. So our people are having to get on their property and to do what we do to locate their facilities and things like that. So it is it's actually harder to stay away from people in some cases than it has been because more people are at home, but nothing out of the ordinary for us other than to follow the guidelines.
Mm-hmm. What about DTE? Your people come into contact with a lot of people in the public. What guidelines do you have, Matt?
Well, people won't be surprised. I guess all power companies do have to enter customers' property or homes at some point. So, what you're seeing at home is a mirror of what happens for us. If we have to go in somebody's home, and of course, our employees are asked to assess that situation carefully first. But if they do have to go in, then they're doing things like, asking before they go in if anybody in the household had tested positive. Does anybody have a fever? And regardless of the answer to that, I believe that they're also asking people if they would mind staying in a different room while the worker is doing the work where they need to be. Mm-hmm. So trying to keep that distance even after they've ascertained that it is, apparently safe to go in somebody's home.
Yeah, I know in your fleet, Katie, Siemens does have guidelines on having employees continually assess their situation, being cognizant of hazards they may be encountering. I was wondering for the listening attendees if you might go into that a little bit more detail, explaining how those guidelines are implemented and what's involved in those guidelines.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So information and resources are being provided to all employees, and some of it might be a little different based on the job role. So for those who may be in a situation where, there's a known hazard, You know, the direction is to, you know, if it's not something that they can mitigate, and there are specific instructions on how you may mitigate that depending on the situation, you know, employees are being instructed to stop, reach out to their manager, and then, you know, work with them, and then together you can make the right decision to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about, you know, I think Siemens also does a lot of work on healthcare facilities or areas like that.
Yes.
What sort of guidance do you give to employees that are going into areas where there has been known exposure that's occurred in the past? What sort of instructions do you provide to your drivers in dealing with that?
Yeah, so basically every effort should be made to identify ways that they can perform the work in such a way that, you know, that exposure isn't possible. You know, certainly social distancing, you know, what it should really be called physical distancing, because it's not about communication, it's about maintaining a distance of 6 feet from one another. I think we're all pretty accustomed to that at this point. You can't walk into a store without seeing the tape in front of the registers, kind of showing you the 6 feet apart. At least that's what's going on in New Jersey. I just assume it's everywhere. But this is really a key aspect of stopping the spread. So it's important for employees, and of course, you know, washing hands, all the things that we, you know, keep reading, and the guidance that's been put out there by the CDC. You know, it's very much, you know, repetitive and being communicated out to the employees that find themselves in these situations.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here from the audience. It asks, how do you handle with non-trained company drivers that might have a low skill level? They primarily have security guards as drivers. Any sort of advice in this area in terms of training that should be offered there, or is it no different than what you offer other drivers?
I would say make it as simple as possible. Communicate often, simplify it. The video that Matt showed earlier is a perfect way to do that. I think everybody's accustomed to learning information from videos these days. I could go on YouTube and learn how to replace my roof. So yeah, definitely simplify the content and repeat it often.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent discussion there. Let's move on to another area, and this is something that all of us encounter in our own personal lives, is acquiring cleaning supplies, or if professionally, you know, protective gear. There still seems to be ongoing shortages in that area. And I know Phil and I had a conversation earlier, and your company kind of developed a unique way of handling it. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, Phil. It's basically called, if you see it, buy it.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, we have, you know, almost 10,000 employees, and they're in 48 states. A lot of them don't report to an office. Almost none of them do. So they're basically by themselves all day. So getting supplies to our, you know, our technicians and our employees in general is not always that easy. We have a great supply group, procurement group that has been working around the clock, you know, in bulk purchases and trying to get, you know, things, PPE and safety and everything out to our employees, and they're phenomenal and they're doing a great job. But there's still those people it's very hard to get to when they're out in, you know, just in the middle of nowhere all day long. So our company introduced exactly what you said, a program where it said, if you see it and you need it, then buy it. And what it is, it allows our employees to, you know, if in the course of their time they see things that they need, like hand sanitizer, disinfectant wipes, or soap, even bottled water, you know, to keep going, and even toilet paper, and also gloves and things like that are necessities for them. You know, either directly related to their job or just to keep them going, you know, as a person who is living, you know, on their own or with their family. If they need something that they have to have, go ahead and buy it, and just keep the receipt, and the company would reimburse them. I don't know of any. I don't personally know of how many people, you know, have taken advantage of this, but I just know that, you know, through our HR department and our EHS department, they've communicated this several times to our employees, and I just thought it was a tremendous,
I think it's an effective and a good strategy to employ there.
Yeah.
Prior to the pandemic coming in play, I know a lot of corporations have had mandates coming out of their procurement department saying, you can't purchase any goods or services out of contract. You shouldn't be using non-preferred suppliers, and it's referred to as rogue spending. But does that really come into play nowadays in this type of an environment? And I know, Katie, you and I have spoken about the need for kind of collaborating with different departments, thinking out of the box, pooling resources. In this case here, what sort of advice or discussions has Siemens had in this area in allowing a little bit more flexibility in the acquisition of these supplies and cleaning materials?
Yeah, so certainly prior to this, you couldn't purchase a pencil or a bucket truck without going through the proper channels and doing things a certain way. But this situation really changes that. So, personal protection equipment is in high demand. Obviously, it's hard to come by. So Siemens realizes there's no one-size-fits-all approach. But the overall message to all employees and the different departments sourcing this equipment is that, we're all working together to figure out what the best channels are for making sure that we supply every employee with the protection equipment they need, depending on what, work sites that they're dealing with or whatever the situation may be. Just recently, I saw one of the latest updates is, instruction on making your own mask, a DIY approach. Maybe we can't get you masks just yet, but so, here's something you can do on your own. And I think that's a great tip to send to an employee like myself who's going to be working from home for the foreseeable future. But as I go out to the grocery store and things like that, I think I can make myself a very fashionable mask so that maybe I don't feel so weird wearing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent points in regards to that. I've gotten a couple other emails from attendees. One is, how are you handling the pickup of a vehicle that needs to be sanitized and is located at an employee's home who is tested positive for COVID-19? Anyone want to tackle that question? Or do you have any policies in place to address that?
We haven't seen that yet, but I can tell you sort of on a related area, we had, I mentioned earlier, all these rental vehicles that had to be delivered, and to be able to maintain social distancing, we actually used tow companies to tow and deliver perfectly running vehicles as a way to get around putting somebody in that vehicle that could possibly contaminate it before our crew got it. And so my guess is you could do the opposite. You could tow that vehicle as opposed to, having a drive-away service come get it.
Mm-hmm. Another question from, kind of an interesting question from another attendee is posed to any one of the three of you, but what's taking up most of your time now? Is prior to this pandemic, we kind of had set routines. There was a lot of unpredictability in terms of, driver issues or fires that had to be put out, but I think things are now in a different context. And what's kind of occupying your time in the past several weeks? And maybe I'll start that off with you, Phil, and then ask Katie and Matt.
Yeah, a lot of it from us has just been reacting. Obviously the first and foremost is employee safety, but I think probably for me, once you get past that piece of it, it's been trying to prepare and look at how this is going to affect us bottom line. Again, safety is the first and foremost, but we all know that eventually the financial repercussions of all this are going to, wreak havoc on a lot of companies. So I've been spending a lot of time just looking at ways that we can, save cash, hunker down, if you will, and look at things like, we're disrupting our normal recycling program, and we're not putting new vehicles on the road because our employees are, off on leave, or We have vehicles that are sitting at our upfitters, and we have interim interest, compounding on them, and things like that, so that we can look forward and say, what are we doing? What can we do now that maybe can help us as we get out of this? And another piece of that is managing for when this is over, because our company, the nature of our business being service oriented, when the economy kicks back in, we feel like we're going to probably get on the tail of a whirlwind, and hopefully our business will skyrocket, and we just want to make sure that we're prepared for that.
Mm-hmm. But you brought up a point about getting the vehicles from the upfitters. One thing that I've been hearing a lot is many of the upfitters are still open, still performing work on vehicles, and getting things done on schedule. But the problem seems to be on the transport side. There are difficulties finding these haul-away vehicles to move the trucks. Are you encountering that in any of your operations, Phil?
We have a little bit of both going on. We have some upfitters that have, I think predominantly it's because of their locality. They are in more of the hot spots that have closed down. And we have our other predominant upfitter who at this point has had no closures in any of the plants that we're using. And we're very fortunate. And I talk to them all the time just to see how they're doing. And as of right now, knock on some wood here, they're lucky, and they're taking the precautions. They're closing a little early every day, and they're going through the processes that Matt just talked about, with wiping down their tools and their workspaces and our vehicles when they're done, so that they're cleaned. And but right now we're seeing a little bit of that from both sides. As far as transport, we do kind of our own transporting outside of that, and we're lucky in that we're an IRP plated company or fleet. So we don't have to go through the BMV to relicense or replate vehicles when we're transferring them from state to state. So that is helping us a lot too. And we've also provided, the documentation from the Homeland Security and things like that to our transport people. So if there is question about why they are transporting our vehicles, it's pretty obvious that they're USIC branded vehicles, and they're going someplace for a reason, for a company that's supporting infrastructure. So we haven't had any issues as of yet with that. So
let's move this down the line with the individual panelists. So Katie, what's occupying your time now differently in managing a fleet during a pandemic? What's consuming your day-to-day work?
Yeah, I would agree with Phil. I think the last month or so has really been very much reactionary. So we're just trying to understand the impact, new vehicle orders and registrations, and transporting vehicles and all of those things that we know are being impacted right now. So once we figure out, okay, what's the impact? How do we then, kind of track all of this, do our best to mitigate it, and then at the same time communicating it out to the field. So we've worked really closely with our fleet management company to make sure that we're on top of all of that. But certainly, it's already being talked about, and this is, the impact for the future that we really need to consider. Again, similar to Phil, we really need to think of the financial impact and how this is going to ultimately change our business forever, and change our society and the way we do things. It'll be really interesting to see what comes of it.
Matt, from a utility fleet perspective, how's your job changed? What's consuming your time at the moment?
Yeah, I've got two answers for that, but if I can take a minute, I want to go back to one of the other questions first, if that's all right.
Sure, of course.
About keeping the physical distance while we're out in the field. One area that I think it's important for all fleets to consider is what happens when one of your drivers gets in a crash, and how are you going to change the procedures when they're in a crash. And so we just initiated some changes, still make sure the driver's safe, all that. But when it comes to exchanging information with the other driver, we're recommending that our driver put their license on the hood or the fender of the vehicle step back, let the other driver take a picture of their ID and their insurance and all the stuff that you have to exchange, and then take photos of the damage as opposed to signing off on a report. Most areas tell us that the police aren't going to respond to a minor crash anyway because they don't want the face-to-face interactions if they can avoid it. So I would just, my answer there is, give some thought to what you would recommend your drivers do when they get in a crash. It's stressful enough already. And in these circumstances, it's even more stressful. So that was one tip. In terms of, I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to just say, while we're on that topic, there's some excellent, and that's an excellent point that you bring up, is handling accidents and the types of instructions you give drivers. Another important thing I heard is sometimes, if the vehicle's inoperative in days prior to the pandemic, it wouldn't be unheard of for the driver to actually hitch a ride with the tow truck operator in the cab. And that's one of the things that, is a big no-no now, and people are kind of advising against it and looking to find your own alternative. And while Matt brought this up, I know, Phil, you and I spoke also. USIC has some policies in place dealing with how your employees deal with accidents. Is there anything additional you might be able to add to that?
Not a lot. In addition to what Matt just talked about, we definitely, have put out there to handle, the exchange of insurance and licensing and things like that, like Matt talked about. We are in a lot of states, and we've contacted our accident management company and our fleet management company about how many of them are actively using the cold crash type of approach where everything's done online. To my knowledge, we have not. I mean, I've been checking with some of the states where we know, or at least we think that's in effect, and we have not ran across it as of yet. But we'll, we want to be prepared for when it happens. But we definitely do that, and then we also recommend, to your point, Mike, about the tow truck thing, is our our fleet management company is they also handle our towing and roadside assistance, and they are working with our drivers to make sure that they have the opportunity to either we have a corporate Uber or Lyft or something like that, if that's available, and if not, I've even recommended that our drivers contact one of their personal family members if they're in in a location where they could do that, because that is someone who they've interacted with, and there wouldn't be that social distancing. That's one. If it's your own vehicle or your own family, and if you're not hurt, obviously, and just need a ride because your vehicle's inactive, then that might be an opportunity as well. Those were some of the suggestions that we made.
Okay. It's interesting segue dealing with accidents, but I kind of cut you off, Matt, in terms of how your day-to-day routine has changed now in this environment. I was maybe wondering if you might be able to address that briefly.
Sure. Just real quick, two things. Phil already touched on, I think, the most important one. We know that when we come out of this whole experience has been very expensive. All the extra vehicles we've had to put in service and everything. And so we know we're going to be in a cost crunch. And so I'm trying to help the team get organized in terms of identifying cost savings opportunities. And then just trying to maintain results on all the stuff that has to be done. I think it was Katie that talked about, you're still in the middle of ordering and all of that. And with the rest of the organization focused on responding to the immediate crisis in front of them, it's hard to get anybody to focus on the day-to-day stuff that we still have to get done. So I think between those two things, it's taken up most of my time.
Yeah, and in fact, up to this point now, we've been reactionary in a lot of the things that we've been doing. So, as fleet managers, but eventually this will recede, and I think the key point, and I think Phil, you touched upon this, is being more proactive and looking ahead as to what needs to be done. And I'd like to pose this question for Katie as to what you see as being the top priorities for fleets in the aftermath of this pandemic. How are you being proactive, and how is Siemens being proactive in looking to the future?
Yeah, so we're trying to get a handle on, so we were talking about new vehicle deliveries. So just understanding, so vehicles that we anticipated to arrive at the dealership, let's say over the next few months or so, we realize they may not be arriving. And so what does that mean in terms of the used vehicle going off to auction, or even if, let's say, we were swapping a vehicle out with something much more fuel efficient, how is this going to impact all of the things that we've been measuring and working towards to optimize our fleet? So we need to adjust, budgeting. We need to, work with the businesses specifically to understand, what we can do with them, like Matt was saying. Where can we find ways to save? Because we know that there's going to be an impact from all of this when it's all said and done. And it's about being prepared the next time, so this is very unique. And of course, we all have business continuity plans, but I think this is different from anything that we could have kind of thought or planned for. So I think it's a really great opportunity to help yourself to make sure you're a bit more prepared as these things happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've been, we meaning fleet managers, have been improvising with, reactions to things that we're encountering or field employees are encountering out in the field as a result of this pandemic. And we've actually created new procedures on addressing these. I'd like to pose a question to Matt is, do you envision any of these modifications now becoming standard practice within your organization, and what you might have done now in a reactionary thing? Do you think those are going to become permanent changes? And what impact might this pandemic have on your overall fleet in terms of fleet policy?
Well, Mike, I'm one of those silver lining kinds of guys, so I'm hoping that there are some positive impacts that are lasting. This sort of caught us in the middle of a much needed update to our processes and system in terms of fleet anyway. So I'm hoping that we sort of rushed along the digitization, if you will, of some of our processes that had been paper intense in the past. So we're hoping that, those will hold and that we'll be able to maintain and enhance those processes. And then one thing that the organization has looked at in the past and in fact is experimenting with now is sort of flexible workspace. So not many people on our team were working from home, but I think we're seeing through all of this prior to this COVID outbreak, but I think we're seeing how efficient we can be working from home. So whether that results in more people working from home at times, or possibly just flexible workspaces within the building, which is something that the company's looking at anyway. I just hope that there are going to be some long-lasting positive impacts as a result of all of this.
Mm-hmm. Phil, what sort of advice or what are you doing to be proactive in looking at your fleet management after this pandemic is behind us?
Yeah.
Do you see
very
any
much
changes in your fleet?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think very much like Matt was just talking about, there's a lot of, situational things that we didn't really think about, or at least I didn't really think about in our fleet. We've always, we go through all sorts of organizational initiatives on our vehicles to be more, to be more productive. We focused on where our, equipment was on our vehicles and stuff. But one of the things we didn't really focus on as much is like not only the vehicle that we've been talking about, is it clean and all that kind of stuff, because someone may have to be in it. They also have a laptop in there. They have instruments. They have locating equipment. They have a cell phone. They have all this other stuff that we've never really addressed. How do you keep it clean, or what are you doing to keep it clean? And I do think that's going to be something that'll probably stick with us after this is all over. And I think, similar to what Matt was saying about the work initiative, I mean, we have 10,000 plus or minus vehicles, and they are a lot of our technicians. That's their office, and we go back and forth on whether or not how we are using mobile, the mobile capabilities of that vehicle, or the hotspot in the vehicle. Are we going to use how do we use the telematics, and how do we put a desk in there so that the employee can work with his laptop or his or her tablet. And so I think a lot of that, because it is a very secluded and mobile piece of functionality for our company, for that employee, it's very important to keep it up and running, because that employee can do just about his everything from that vehicle. So I mean, it's important to keep that vehicle as like his oasis, right? I mean, I see that as being more important for us going forward. I mean, that's just what I've been thinking about. I don't know if that makes sense, in general for everybody, but I think it does. I think it does for us anyhow. But
yeah, the other thing that I would add on my time, on my part, is this is the time that fleet managers should be, documenting these changes, and now is the time that we ought to be looking at whether our fleet policies need updating as a result of the things that we've encountered now. I mean, there was a time when texting was not around, but now it's in every single fleet policy. Many states here in the U.S. are legalizing the use of marijuana. Now that's an issue that is being addressed in fleet policy. These are new issues that are coming up, and you need to have these documented where appropriate in your fleet policy. But I'm looking at the clock here, and we could easily take on another hour on a lot of other areas of discussion, and perhaps this could be a good segue to say that this could be the opportunity to maybe even have a follow-up webinar in regards to this. But would like to thank all of the three panelists and thank AFLA for its collaboration in producing this webinar. Also, there are resources that are available. There's many of them throughout the industry. The one that I can speak of is on the automotive-fleet.com website, and we have a special resource center, the COVID-19 Resource Center. So there's a lot of additional information that you could get there, and would encourage everyone to go there, and we're continually updating it also. So with that, thank you to my three panelists. Thank you to AFLA, and thank you to all of the attendees that are listening to this webinar. So with that, I'd like to conclude this and encourage everyone to be safe, and likewise with this slogan, we're all in this together, helping one another. So with that, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.